All right, Chris, another chapter for eAuction. I'm excited today. We're doing a good one. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. I'm excited too. It's good to be with you again, Ron. And this is a really exciting webinar series that we're going through. And today, going through payments. That's certainly something that every seller and really every kind of auction platform owner is interested in. So let's dive in and get into it.
Sounds great. Yeah, I mean, this one is big because, and I'll just kick it off and then let you kind of really dive into the technical part of it. One, it's got to be right. I mean, we're dealing with people's money here, right? And especially with the size of the auctions, you don't want to pay for a $2 million thing and then have the transaction, have them ship the item, and then all of a sudden have the funds not cleared or something. So you've got to have one word that we're going to use a ton today is obviously governance, right? You've got to have the governance. You have to know how to set those governance rules, how to enforce them, how to ensure that the buyers and sellers are following them, how to audit that. That's one. And then two, obviously on all the different platforms, we talked about this, I think in chapter 2 or 3, I think 3, we were talking about all the different devices, right? And all the different device types. So when you're talking about different payments and enforcing governance, you have to enforce that across phones and tablets. And then I think the third element we'll really cover today is the internationalization of auctions, because now all of a sudden I might be dealing with multilingual, multi-currency. With the EU, I might be dealing with GST, VAT taxes, and GDPR, escrow funds. I mean, there's about 15, 20 different things, and we're literally just talking about payments, which is kind of funny, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right. It's probably, of course, kind of one of the most sensitive, if not the most sensitive aspects, just because this is kind of where the finality of the transaction occurs, at least as far as the kind of technical details. This is going to be kind of the pinnacle security aspect as well. Um, and there's an element of trust here because this platform itself isn't necessarily going to be taking accountability for every portion of the payment and the rendering or fulfilling of the items purchased. So yeah, it's really complex. Ultimately, is kind of the right word to use to describe it. But yeah, fundamentally, what we're dealing with here is a overall kind of set of criteria that, depending on your market, can be relatively simple. It's going to have several underpinning components from a technical side of things that are just kind of consistent principles that you'll see throughout. Number one, the actual process itself has to account for the buyer and seller governance, like you said, Ron. And these are workflows that are unique to auctions. So, this is something that you're going to want to make sure that you're actually considering when you're looking at an auction platform. Is the auction platform capable of handling some of these principles that we'll go into in more detail today? And then, like you said as well, depending on the scenario, it could be much more complex because, in addition to dealing with buyers and sellers and making sure that there's some form of escrow or there's some proof of ability to pay, or possibly a reserve or some ability to, have a governance around issue resolution and remediation. Could also be dealing with multi-currency, multilingual, intermodal shipments, international shipments, VAT,
Mm-hmm.
multi faceted array of different variables here, right? So we're going to get
Yeah.
into those today, and I'm excited to kind of get into the weeds on some of those here.
That's excellent. Well, let's go ahead and kick it off, and we'll jump right into governance first. So so governance. I'll just kind of define it, and then I'll let you kind of dive into the technical aspects of governance. So governance you might just replace that word with the legalities, rules, regulations, policies, procedures. All of that kind of falls into that umbrella of what we call governance. So the governance is literally the rules and laws that oversees everything that happens within the site. So this could be governance around bidders and how they pre-authorize, like with Barrett Jackson. I might have to go in and send in ahead of time within 2 days before the auction to register as a bidder. I might have to send in a bank statement showing I have a balance of at least 50,000 in an account. That might be governance. I can't just show up and bid on a car and not have any money to pay for it, because now that person has spent thousands of dollars to get that car to auction, to sell it in front of all those people, and there were all those buyers, and then I just went, sorry, I don't have the money to pay for it. There's huge ramifications. So there's governance around just registering as a bidder, simply wanting to even put in a bid, right? So it starts all the way from governance around how you could sell an item. I've seen many of those, especially the car ones. I follow them a lot, where they'll have strictly no reserve auctions. And sometimes it's because they're only in an area or facility for the day, so they have to clear them out, so they don't have time to spend 5 to 10 minutes per auction. They only have like 2 minutes per auction. And the only way they can get the 1,000 cars through is to have a no reserve auction. And so a lot of people that aren't willing to let their car go no reserve, they won't even bid. And so there will be governance around, what's the word I'm looking for? Marketing your auctions and telling people the types of auctions that are available. So you'll want to make sure that the governance is something that can be easily articulated and marketed so that people very quickly can understand the rules governing your site, right? So let's go ahead and dive in, Chris, to some of those governance rules. And let's kind of really, and especially today we're talking about payments, but we can mention some of the other governance things as we bounce through these ideas.
Well, thanks, Ron. That's that's a great example to use with the car auctions. I think really fundamentally, a lot of what we're dealing with is more complex auctions or scaled auction sites that are going to have some level of fidelity either at scale or because of the nature of the auction itself. And so ultimately, the governance is frankly probably the most important aspect of the business itself and how the business is going to operate, because really, if you're looking to have your auction site actually automate and self-service, the governance has to be locked in. If it's not,
Agreed.
then basically you're going to be manually operating the business forever. And that's probably the plight of a lot of the listeners is they are manually operating some aspects of their business, maybe not all of them. And we would encourage you to really think about the governance for this. And so, what are you able to do that other folks in the industry are doing? They're really best practice, and this is always changing. And so, I guess fundamentally with payments, when it comes down to the payments themselves, like you were saying, Ron, being able to concisely articulate and usually even in a visual way. So showing
Mhm.
icons, having filters for different types of auctions, and the rules governing those auctions. That's really helpful for the buyers. Whenever a seller is listing, making sure that the payment type and the terms and kind of the nuances of whether or not there's a reserve or if someone has to meet some form of pre-qualification or if they're going to have to go through a detailed escrow and fulfillment process that has multiple approval workflows, whatever it is, the seller needs to be well aware of this as well. And so this is essentially the credibility of your auction marketplace on the line. At every time a buyer and seller meet, you're the one facilitating that, or your site is. And the governance is what drives that. And so, anyway, with regards to payments, some of the big things are, like you said, Ron, this concept of presenting it, but then we also have enforcing it. And so, whenever somebody actually does go through and make a bid, one of the most successful ways to kind of enforce something is to just give a friendly reminder. So, when a seller is listing an item, we want them to kind of have this governance kind of visible and in their face, and really just kind of as a friendly reminder. Think of it as like guardrails, or like in the bowling lane, you're putting up the little bumpers on the sides to keep the ball from going into the gutter. And that's how
Yep.
you want to think about your governance. You're trying to make sure everyone stays on track. And fundamentally, whenever it comes to a purchase for a buyer, well, where do they actually begin the engagement? It's when they make a bid. So whenever they're bidding, we want to kind of remind them. And if we see a pattern develop within the system itself, where maybe there are more issues with this type of bid or this size of a deal, maybe it's a larger auction value, etc., then we want to go ahead and put some extra workflow steps in there to kind of pre-qualify or verify with the buyer that they actually understand what they're committing to. And so these are really, really helpful governance steps that can help. And then, of course, once everything is done, once we have a winning bidder and we're going to be kind of taking it offline to complete the transaction, it's really helpful to have a sequence that's going to go out in an automated form that's intelligent, that matches each of the different payment processes and sets of rules. And so, again, this is kind of rather non-technical, but this is kind of what makes or breaks these processes, having little reminders that go to the buyers and sellers. And just think about what they're dealing with. If you put yourself in their shoes, they're operating their own business. They may not have as many resources, or this particular person working as the seller may not have as many resources within their role to be able to completely focus on this. So we need to be able to concisely and clearly articulate to them, hey, you have a buyer. They bought your thing. Now you need to take
Yep.
these steps to fulfill it. And by the way, as a friendly reminder, normally if you respond and you confirm within an hour to 4 hours, that's going to leave the buyer feeling more satisfied. This is data that we've analyzed. That's just how it goes. The faster you respond and confirm that their purchase is being processed and moved into fulfillment, they're going to feel a sense of relief at knowing that and seeing that progression. Then, if you can provide the tracking info for their shipment within this time period, it's going to depend on your industry and how your particular space works and some of the nuances. Obviously, if it's an intermodal shipment, it's going to be somewhat challenging to get tracking information right away. Uh, but the bottom line is, if you can coach essentially with your governance and kind of send a sequence to the buyer and seller of what to expect once that payment process is started, that's also going to be extremely helpful. But then, Ron, and I'll kind of briefly touch on this and see if you want to chime in here. Then we have all of the back office pieces too. So the buyer and seller engage. We send these automated steps, and they're completing the process. Depending on how complex the purchase is, it may be a multi-step process, including an escrow approval, etc. But then we also have the back office side of it for the seller, and dealing with VAT and dealing with taxes. Maybe there's customs and duties, or just even if it's just all in the U.S., there are different taxes for different counties and different states. Sometimes it's just state tax, sometimes it's county specific, and so this can get rather detailed for the seller. They're probably not going to have time to deal with all this. So we need to be able to deal with all of this in that payment process and try to really automate this. And that's where having a robust platform really makes a difference, doesn't it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's definitely something we've dealt with a million times, right? With our international, I mean, things like GDPR, VAT, GST. When do you do that? We've got clients that just here in the U.S. They do a lot of business in quote unquote North America, right? And so now all of a sudden they've got purchases that are being done in Canada in Canadian dollars, but they're here fulfilling in the US. And so now all of a sudden we're shipping across country lines, and they don't want us to take those transactions that occurred in Canadian dollars. They don't want them in Canadian dollars in their ERP. So we're integrating live conversion, multi-currency conversion APIs midstream, where we're literally parsing events, auctions, sales, parsing that, converting it to US dollars before pumping it into the ERP, so that accounting here in the US can deal with it just in American dollars, and they know exactly what they actually collected because it was collected originally in Canadian dollars. But obviously the purchaser wanted to be able to see it in Canadian dollars because that's what they do every day, right? So simple things like that. I dealt with this last week. I bought, and I think I told you this earlier today when we were talking, I'm big into the classic rock vinyl records, right? So I went out and I bid on 3 records last week. I won 2 of them. And within an hour of winning the auction, I already had an email saying, okay, you have 24 hours to pay for that. And then, when I paid for it, there's another notification goes to the seller that says, you now have 72 hours to ship this. And so, like you just said, you literally walked through the reminders, and I experienced that last week. So, some of the payment types that we're talking about here, let's dive into a few of those. So I'll just kind of mention them. And then if you want to go into the actual integration of those and how we integrate those and deal with those, that would be a good idea. Because especially when we start getting into multi-currency and international, these can make a big difference, right? So the payment types that we want to accept commonly on these auction platforms, um, check. Is it a certified check? Do we allow checks? And then what's the governance around a check? Do they just know that there's going to be at least a week delay of the shipment of the item until the funds clear? And then what happens if the funds don't clear? What's the governance and what are the repercussions? And do they still have to pay if their check doesn't clear? How do you go through the arbitration or mediation to fix that kind of stuff, right? So you have to think through the governance of just the payment types you expect. But check, wire funds, right? EFTs, ACH payments, e-checks, purchase orders, a credit account. Sometimes you can be forced to put money in a credit account and have a balance with the clearinghouse. And then you go in and then you can pay and buy things against and up to whatever your credit account is. So you might want to come in and register funds ahead of time and put it in a credit account. And maybe that's how you enforce the funds. And so now that's kind of a pseudo escrow, isn't it? It's almost kind of like an escrow account. Or do we deal with escrow? So if you want to talk about, let's talk a little bit about just the integration of those different payment types. Because if you think about it, if I do a debit card and pay with a debit card, there's a 0% fee collected on a debit card. If I pay by credit card, there's a 3%. If I switch to American Express or PayPal, it's a 4%. If I switch to escrow, it's typically a 15%, right? So just knowing the fees that are captured with each of these and who's going to pay those fees or who has to eat those fees can be a big deal in knowing just the types of payments you're going to collect, correct?
Yeah, that's a great point. And this is something that we've seen whenever we get to a point with clients where they're collecting a lot of revenue, and this matters at scale. And frankly, whenever you get to the even 3 to 4%, that begins to matter pretty quickly. It certainly matters for the end user too. They're going to need to know if they're going to be paying extra fees, and it needs to be very visible to them. But
Right.
just if you just look at it technically, a lot of the payment providers, they don't offer all of these options, or they may not offer all of these options with terms that are favorable. So there may be a favorable set of terms for one of these options, like paying via credit card and paying via debit card, let's say. So we get an
Mm-hmm.
optimized payment provider for that. And then we probably will end up recommending a slew or myriad of different payment providers for an escrow type of model that may be and typically are separate from the credit card and debit card payment provider. So how do you seamlessly integrate that? And putting that into the checkout process, into the actual kind of, you've won the bid, now you need to actually make a payment, into that workflow. Really, it ought to be really seamless for the end user, so they kind of see visually a nice visual, very intuitive UI. Again, using icons to our advantage, taking advantage of kind of industry best practices for what different icons typically mean, and brief text description, and then kind of like more detail as needed. But behind the scenes and kind of, deep inside of the actual platform, there's a lot of nuance to getting some of these different models to work. And like you were talking about, Ron, once we process a payment with multiple different payment providers, let's say there's one for debit and one for credit card, one for check based payment, and then one for escrow payments. Well, we may also have additional payment providers for different countries, because depending on the payment provider, they may not serve all countries. Well, we can wire all of this together behind the scenes, using a modular capability of an eAuction platform, like the Clarity eAuction platform. Um, but then you also have all of the integration to the back office. So how are we then taking that and drilling into that data and pushing it out to the sellers so they have what they need to operate their accounting? And similarly for your business as a whole, for your e-auction company, integrating that back to your ERP system or accounting software. So these are all really key considerations. And frankly, one of the biggest challenges that can happen here is whenever something doesn't go through properly, Maybe there's a refund, or somebody wants to process something with a wallet, or reuse payment information, etc. Any of these type of scenarios, you're going to want to think through all of the edge cases with each of the different payment gateways or payment providers, and consider all of the nuances of these as well. So we typically go through all of this in discovery, right, Ron? And it's fascinating how much detail you can get into, how quickly. But kind of the magic here is picking and choosing based on what's best for the business, and being able to prioritize so that we get the highest payoff for the lowest upfront cost, right?
Yeah, I agree, Chris. And you kind of brushed it quickly, but let's dive into the integration to the back office that you just mentioned, because that's one of the things that I feel like Clarity has a big advantage is over the 16 years we've been in business with our integration platform, Clarity Connect, which we really haven't talked about during this series yet. We've integrated over 3,000 different back office integrations. So we literally can integrate with any ERP, CRM, PIM, WMS. I mean, you name it, we integrate with it, right? We've done it for thousands of companies. So the issue here is most auction platforms can integrate with a lot of the payment providers because every e-commerce platform, every auction platform has to do the basics, right? They have to integrate with authorized.net, PayPal, and things like that. That part's easy. The hard part is when all of a sudden in midstream, I have to, and I mentioned that one scenario a minute ago, the dollars come or the order comes in Canadian dollars. And then in the back end, that gets sent through fulfillment, but they're fulfilling it in another country. Where and how does that translation happen? Does it happen when it just goes into my charge account and authorized.net gets it in Canadian dollars, but they put it into my account in US dollars since I bank with them? Okay, some of that's automated. But when it gets reported into my ERP for fulfillment for my accounting team, it's not going to flip that, right? So I may want to have our Clarity Connect in the back end connecting multiple different entities and APIs because we have different things. And we're going to talk about this on an upcoming slide here in a minute. An API for switching to payment plans if somebody opts to pay with a payment plan. Currency conversion rate. We might want to have a live API that we can go out and get any country's currency rate at the exact time that the auction closed. So we can come back to you in your ERP and post in your accounting application that this one cleared and these are the commissions that should be paid out, right? That might be another API. We might need the other APIs like we talked about on I think it was chapter 5, we talked about escrow and we talked about Payoneer and some of the escrow payments. That's another API. We might have an API into the scheduling application. So as we're scheduling all the auctions, we know what auctions are coming up and when they're going. And if you're offering warehousing and distribution of the items like Amazon Prime does, right? You're kind of going up and buying things on Amazon, but with Prime, they actually house and warehouse items and ship that and then take another rate. And so Amazon has to track all that. And you might be doing that. That happens a lot, especially when auctions are both brick and mortar and online. For example, like an estate auction, right? They bring all those estate items and then they'll have a local auction there, but they'll also have video cameras and have it online broadcast so people can go online and go, oh, hey, I want that heirloom, but there'll be people in the room as well. And so now the auction house has to deal with a lot more than just allowing a transaction to occur in their e-auction platform. They're literally dealing with storing lots, tracking timing, when's it come up on auction, selling and shipping those items as well. So Connect is our integration platform that allows us to connect to APIs, SDK, databases, file types, all of the different types of connections that you would have with all of these different entities. We're going to cover a couple of them, one here on payments. We're going to cover a second one when we talk about VAT, GST, taxes, international shipping labels, things like that. That's another one that we're going to talk about. So thanks for bringing that up. I think that's a great idea. Let's go in next and why don't you introduce us, since now we talked about Connect and we've got this API, why don't you just kind of talk about the different types and many different payment gateways and payment entities that we've integrated with over the past and how we do that?
Absolutely. Thanks. And fundamentally, the main takeaway here for anyone who's listening is whenever you're working with a auction platform provider, you want to look for adaptability. And we've talked about this before. Whenever it comes to payments, this is absolutely critical. And this is a big challenge for a lot of SaaS based platforms. So they tend to be very commoditized. And so this can be good in the sense that they're going to be constantly rolling out new features, but it can also be bad in a sense that maybe a particular workflow or process that you need for your business, they're not going to adapt to that. They're going to stick with a more commoditized path. And this can really become evident with payment providers. There are a lot of very popular payment providers that have listed here that we've worked with in the past. The bottom line, though, is that we can work with any payment provider that has an API. So any payment provider that's available, we can incorporate for you. And this is really powerful when you get to a very specialized market, kind of a high end market, or operating at scale and working to take advantage of a particular beneficial payment provider that has very beneficial rates or possibly terms that just make more sense for your customers, and maybe a specific escrow workflow like we've talked about in the past. And so having this adaptability is fundamental to, we think, how you're going to scale your business. This is what we've seen over the years. We've seen many customers come to us and say, we painted ourselves into a corner. How many times have we seen that before, Ron, where they come to us and that's kind of the bottom line, right?
Countless.
Yeah. So that's what we would advise here. But the other piece that we're always looking at is being able to turnkey quickly progress your business kind of from where it is to that ideal point down the road. So you have to have very turnkey options off the shelf. You can see a lot of those here. This is a representative list, and regardless of whether you work with Clarity or another e-auction platform, we encourage you to look for this kind of capability, not just in the payment side, but really everywhere. This is just kind of us showing this, what we're capable of on the payment side of things.
Yeah, and this is just a small list. I mean, the most important thing to understand as you're picking a platform is you will never only connect to one, because probably 50% or more of your auctions are going to be tracked and won from a mobile device. So do you want, or have you thought about allowing Apple Pay, Google Pay, mobile pay options? And have you integrated that from the get go? So when people win these auctions and get a notification and they're out on their phone and they have to pay for that item, have you thought about that? And are you going to allow them to pay? I mean, I've got my Apple Pay attached to my bank card, and I pay my rent every month, mortgage payments every month. I pay car payments. I mean, and I don't do all those. I'm just saying you can literally with Apple Pay,
Right.
right? Um, with any payment device. And that's what you have to think about. So, one of the things you can do is you can look at your different devices just using simple Google Analytics, right? What are the devices hitting your website and what's the breakdown? I remember when I came here to Clarity 10 years ago, if I'm remembering correctly, it was like 14% of the people coming to our website when I got here was like on a mobile device. And I think the last time I checked, and it was, I don't know, a couple of years ago, what was it? It was up in the like 70% or 50%. I mean, it was like more
The
than half
majority.
now were
Yeah.
mobile visits, right? And so obviously you have to make sure that you understand the representative audience and even the devices that they're coming to. And are they going to pay from those devices? Or are you going to force them to drive somewhere, get on a computer, and only pay from a computer, right? So the more convenient and the more options that you've thought through that specifically target and service your audience, the better and the more they're going to come back and do repeat business on your platform.
That's right.
Right.
Exactly.
Well, let's dive in. And the last section today, we're going to actually go through some of the different features of payments, and let's talk through some of those, right? So the first one, just about taking payments, might really be before we even take a payment, right? We mentioned it just briefly at the start of today on the car one, right? I might have to go in and show a bank statement having 50,000 in the bank before I can come in and bid on the car auctions. It Barrett Jackson, right? That might be one simple example. But let's talk briefly about the pre-authorization and the different options that might be there, especially when you're talking about gigantic auctions, real estate auctions, art, jewelry, things like that.
Absolutely. So this is a really interesting topic, and there's a lot of depth to it. The starting place, though, is going back to what we talked about earlier about governance. And we really can't say that enough. Whenever you're thinking about your site and you're thinking about how successful it is, that is a baseline for customer sat, for the ability to have a credibility that folks who are using your platform can rely on. And that's really what you want to have as kind of your North Star as you're going through this entire process. How can I make this site something that I would love to use and I would know I could trust, that these rules are intelligent and they make sense? Okay, so now let's apply that kind of framework to significant payments. If you're
Yeah,
selling something that's very significant, you don't want to just ship it to somebody or even start shipping it or even remove your listing of your auction until you know that that other person can pay for it. And if you're someone who's paying for something that's really expensive, you don't want to process all of your payment and send it away before you have the item fulfilled. Like, you really want to actually have some kind of proof and legal recourse if there isn't a fulfillment of the expectation and what was promised. And so these are just kind of underlying tenets that are more extreme, and they're kind of exponentially more extreme as you get into larger purchase sizes. And so those are the fundamental concepts that we're dealing with. And usually what this means is whenever we're going into a bid, we need to do some form of pre-authorization, making sure that they actually have the funds. Now, this can happen in several different ways. We can do, a simple kind of look at the financials. We can look at a credit statement of the business, verify the business entity that's bidding on the item. There really are a lot of different things we can do. It can be a deposit. It can be a full payment into a clearinghouse where the funds are in that clearinghouse and it's essentially a third party or an escrow. These are all options that we can consider. A lot of times what ends up working well is a non-refundable deposit of some kind or earnest money. And then once the purchase is actually completed, that non-refundable deposit or earnest money gets rolled into the overall purchase. So this is a way to kind of show goodwill, but not have the buyer completely on the hook, and allow the seller to see, hey, they're serious and they're legally obligated. So now I'm going to go ahead and fulfill. It's kind of a give and take. And that's really the big thing that we see here, Ron, is the kind of another common model that we've used is the payment clearing governance. Again, this is kind of like money gets sent in, and maybe it's the full amount, maybe it's a partial amount, but it has to be there in advance of the bid. Maybe it's a proportion
right.
of the bid amount, right? So fundamentally, there's going to be some proof of life in this transaction. And what you want to think about here is that we're leveraging the credibility of the platform of your business to show the buyer and seller, hey, you're allowed to work together. You can trust each other through our process, that this is going to go well. Things are going to be handled
Yeah.
fairly. Another really popular option, especially with international payments or maybe like long lead time, long lag time type of fulfillment, and even for like houses and such, is an escrow type of a model. This is a pretty nice model. Basically, the concept, a lot of fine art or expensive jewelry and etc., would be that we're basically going to be putting a portion of the funds or all of the funds from the buyer into a escrow account. We've seen this a lot with countries that are underdeveloped, that might be perceived from the seller side to have issues with delivery and fulfillment and meeting the expectations that they set. So the buyer puts their funds into an escrow account. The escrow account is managed. If there are issues, there's an arbitration process. Again, we've kind of talked about this in previous videos. But then the seller can fulfill knowing that the funds are in that escrow. Once the buyer accepts, then the buyer can issue an approval, and then the seller gets paid in full. And then, the other thing that's really interesting, and this is relatively new, at least in the level of popularity that we're seeing, is setting up payment plans. So we can use
Yeah.
third-party APIs for payment plans, and this is pretty unique, and this makes it pretty attractive for folks, especially for kind of lower to mid-size ticket items, to be able to finance these purchases after the purchase is made. So this can turn it into a monthly or periodic payment that they're making instead of having to pay for everything all at once. And then finally, you hit on international a little bit, Ron. Feel free to kind of elaborate on that and any of these other points that you think would be helpful for folks just to kind of understand the nuances on these.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you have to think about what is being sold and how is it sold outside of an auction, right? I mean, I've bought 5 homes. Every single one of the homes, when I go in, I have to have my bank, my pre-approval, right? I have to be pre-approved. And then typically I have to put some earnest money in and I get like 10 days so that I can get an inspector to come in and go through and inspect, right? So you have to think through that. And if I'm going to buy that house, that same house that I bought in person online, I'm going to probably want the same kind of thing. So now, are you going to require the home seller to provide an inspection a week before the auction so people can review that so they have an idea that the home's already been through an inspection, a third party certified inspector that you chose that's not biased? Okay, is that done? Do you, before the bidders come on, do you force them to already upload their pre-approval? Do you force them to put in their earnest money? So as soon as the auction's closed, the earnest money is captured and sent to the seller, and now they have that 2 week time to get their own third party inspector if they want to do that. And then at which point in time they have to provide the funds. I mean, it's got to be the same level of trust and high fidelity as an in person engagement, but online. So that is very difficult in and of itself just here in the US. But as you just introduced now, let's start talking about international. So with international, you mentioned there are some countries that may not be as trusted to ensure that you buy and have things shipped, right? And so we talked about escrow. If you want more about escrow, chapter 5 is the video that we cover escrow in depth. We talked about things like Payoneer and escrow.com and dove more into escrow payments. But you're going to introduce additional things. The other thing that you've got, and we already briefly in this webinar talked a little bit about multi-currency and multilingual. Not going to go in too deep there. The things that now really start coming into the customs and the duties and the taxes, VST, GDPR. I mean, those are all acronyms, and I think everybody listening in today probably knows what they are, but we have to deal with those, right? Because if I have an auction here in the States and somebody in the EU is bidding on that, and then they have pre-registered and pre-authorized and put their bank information and stuff up online, do they now have a legal right to say, okay, you have to forget me and delete all that information because GDPR says you have to? But here I am in the US, I'm not even thinking about that, but I've got bidders from around the world that I've allowed, I haven't restricted them to come in and bid. So now I have to start thinking about, well, what happens if somebody in London wins the bid? And then after they win and the whole thing's processed, they want to be able to come in and click a button and say, GDPR says you can forget me now. So now all of a sudden I've dealt with GST, VAT, international shipping rates. How am I going to calculate and let people know? Is that my responsibility as part of the auction platform, or is that between the buyer and the seller? Is GDPR an issue for the site, for me legally on the site? There are 5, 10, 15 different things that you have to think through just because of an international transaction, right? Do you want to talk through some of the technical implications of how we can instrument that in the platform?
Absolutely. You know me, I would love to talk through that. I'll try to keep it high level though, so I don't bore anyone. Um, I would say really a lot of what you just covered was probably technical enough for most folks. The summary though would be that whenever we're dealing with these pieces that have to happen, there can be kind of interdependencies between them. And this is really where you're going to run into trouble from a business perspective with using kind of off the shelf or kind of restricted development access platforms, especially when you get into the level of fidelity that you just described, Ron, which is really what happens whenever businesses scale up or expand to international, et cetera. And really just in any relatively complex scenario. And so this is where you want to work with a e-auction company, an e-auction partner who can deliver this kind of customizability while still kind of coming out of the gate with a very commoditized set of capabilities. And that's really what we provide here at Clarity. We certainly have the experience dealing with the scenarios that Ron just described. And really, I think the bottom line here is that any scenario that you can throw at us, or just in general, if you're looking for kind of the concept of who to look for, if it's not Clarity, a customizable e-auction platform, any scenario that you can throw at a company like Clarity, we can take care of. And that's what you need to look for your business at a certain point. If you're at that point where you're wanting to scale and look at 3 to 5 years down the road, that's really the bottom line is you're going to need someone who can deliver on these capabilities for you and integrate these systems. If you look at all of your competitors, if you look at the large scaled up competitors, that's what they all do behind the scenes. We know we've delivered for many of them already.
Yep.
And
That's
we
true.
certainly want to help you grow and scale into your niche and take over your niche and really continue to grow into multiple categories that you can deliver a lot of value to your customers in. So with that, Ron, feel free to close us out on anything else.
Yeah, sounds great. No, I think you covered it really well, and thanks for that. Well, want to thank the audience again today and hope to see you on a future video. I've also, in the description of each of these webinars, I've gone back and put links to all previous chapters and put descriptions as to what's covered in each chapter. Hopefully that's a little helpful for you. So if you want to go look at the extensibility Chris was just talking about, that's in chapter 5. If you want to talk about integrations, that's in chapter 3. That kind of stuff is in the description. So visit the description. You can revisit any of the previous chapters, and we hope to see you in a future video. Bye for now. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Ron. Bye for now.